Hello, and welcome to History 2023 Arkansas History. Lecture title A New Arkansas. Though the battle between the civil rights movement and its opponents, which had broken out in full force in the mid 1950s, would continue on into the next decade, and we will come back to it before this video is over, it was by no means the only thing of interest happening in Arkansas at this time. Like most parts of America, and perhaps especially the South, there was a variety of changes happening, some of them intersecting with the issue of civil rights on occasion. And whereas in 1950, life in the state still had strong parallels with what it had been at the start of the century, by 1970 it would increasingly resemble what we see around us today. As one might expect, the continuing growth of urban areas was a major theme of the period. Even as late as this, a majority of Arkansans still lived in rural areas, on farms or in communities with less than 2,500 people, but the urban cohort was catching up fast, and sometime around 1970 or immediately thereafter, their numbers would finally overtake those of the rural dwellers. Little Rock, of course, continued to be in the lead. It had crossed the 100,000 mark in the late 1940s, and after mostly flatlining in the following decade, surged again to top 130,000 by 1970. Fort Smith and Pine Bluff, which had nearly doubled in size during World War II, were in second and third respectively, followed by a second tier that included, in no particular order, Fayetteville, Hot Springs, Jonesboro, Texarkana, and West Memphis. None of this was especially new. We've seen evidence of this general trend many times now. What was new was the movement not just into the urban centers, but into the suburbs as well. North Little Rock, in particular, though a town of some significance since the late 19th century, had grown from just over 20,000 in 1940 to roughly 60,000 by 1970, and other nearby communities such as Kamak Heights were coming into their own as well. In the case of the capital especially, some of this was a reflection of the fight over desegregation, as white families moved out of the city itself to avoid sending their kids to school with blacks. But it was also a product of the desire to avoid urban congestion, to move to outlying areas where more land was available. Van Buren was becoming more important as a bedroom community for those working in Fort Smith, for example, and in Helena, residents were moving into the recently formed West Helena, which in time would overtake the original city and eventually lead to the two cities merging as the awkwardly named, if you ask me, Helena West Helena in 2005. Even where separate suburban municipalities did not form, cities were drastically expanding their land area, taking in more and more territory to be converted into subdivisions and businesses, more open and low density than the original downtown cores. The rapid proliferation of shopping malls, office buildings, and cul-de-sac neighborhoods in the western parts of Little Rock, beginning in the 1950s, was the most visible example of this. Now, since I mentioned shopping and these stores and everything, then I guess this is as good a place as any to mention the accompanying expansion of chain stores within the state, especially Walmart, because you can't talk about 20th century Arkansas history without talking about Walmart. Though Sam Walton would open stores under several different names in North Arkansas towns in the post-war era, the first store to actually bear that name opened in Rogers in 1962. And though it was at the outset indistinguishable from other chain stores in the nation, Walton's emphasis on cutthroat price wars and expanding into more and more services meant it would eventually overwhelm most of its competitors. Within 5 years, it had 18 stores across the state, would begin opening new locations outside Arkansas in 1968, and by the 80s at the latest had become a nationally recognized chain, alternately loved and hated, and I, for one, will never stop spelling it without the hyphen and the capital M. It just looks wrong as one word. These signs of urban sprawl were made possible in large part by the fact that Arkansas, like other states, was now heavily dependent on the automobile. Though cars had been around for decades now, the sluggish pace of road construction in the 1910s and 20s meant they were, at that time, a relatively limited presence. The New Deal projects of the 30s had included federally supported road building, though, and by the end of World War II, most of the U.S. highways in the state, such as routes 65, 67, and 70, were in place and decently paved. So too were many of the purely in-state highways, with some, especially Highway 7 running from Camden to Harrison, beginning to be touted by tourism associations as a scenic byway. Then, in 1956, the U.S. government passed the Federal Highway Act, also sometimes known as the Interstate Highway Act, for the creation of a network of 4-lane interstate highways nationwide. Construction on the first of these within the state, Interstate 30 between Little Rock and Dallas, began in 1957, followed by I-55 in 1960 and I-40 in 1964. The completion of these routes would take several years, but by the end of the 1960s, rapid and direct auto traffic from one end of the state to the other and beyond was possible. Between this growing transportation system on the one hand and the growing affluence of middle-class Arkansans on the other, especially those in the cities and/or employed in non-farm work, the state definitely had a car culture, if you will, from the 1950s onward, if it had not had one before. And to an increasing degree, this was true in urban and rural areas alike. In the countryside, even as late as the 1960s, it was not at all unusual to see horse or mule-drawn wagons on the roads, hauling produce to market or even for personal transport, but these were becoming less and less common all the time. This in itself fueled the increased movement to urban areas, as well as the suburban expansion going on. Indeed, once car ownership became widespread, it would have been difficult for this not to happen, for the grid system and narrow streets of the downtown districts in most cities simply were not designed to handle large volumes of auto traffic. As elsewhere in the nation, suburbanization and the car culture were definitely reinforcing one another. Though it was not as closely tied to these other changes, another simultaneous feature of the 50s and 60s in Arkansas was the growth in mass communications and the effects this had on popular culture. The improved road network and the greater presence of motor vehicles had something to do with this. Major newspapers like the Arkansas Gazette could now be delivered to larger and larger areas, for instance. But the critical factor here was the programs of electrification carried out during the New Deal and World War II. By the end of the 1950s, more than 3/4 of homes in the state had electric utilities of some kind, including nearly everyone in the cities and a majority in the countryside. And while the impact of this could be seen in many walks of life, the one worth focusing on here is broadcast media. Radio stations, the first of which had been set up in the early 1920s, now blanketed every corner of the state, including the 50,000-watt KTHS in Hot Springs, and by 1967, nearly 20 of them would have joined together in the Arkansas Radio Network to coordinate statewide news broadcasts. The big story of the 1950s, however, was the advent of television. The first station, KRTV in Little Rock, began broadcasts in 1953, followed a year later by the NBC affiliate KARK, and even as early as this, some people were making experiments with cable television. Within a few years, an overwhelming majority of Arkansas homes had TV sets. There are many directions we could go in when examining the effect of radio, television, and other forms of mass media, but the one that gets pointed to quite a bit, and rightly so, is what many call the homogenization of popular culture. That is to say, there had always been a noticeable difference in the tastes and pastimes of urban and rural residents. The former were more diverse, the latter revolved around family, church, and neighborhood. That division was by no means erased, and I think most of us would agree it exists even today, but it was blurred significantly. After all, these radio and television stations played the same news, the same music, or other forms of entertainment, regardless of who was tuning in or where they were located, and this was doubly true in the case of the networks with their many local affiliates. And since there were only a few of these networks, most people, no matter where they lived in the state, were going to see or hear the same programs. So this did a lot to break down existing divisions in the state, including class or race as well as location, and to give the people of Arkansas some common cultural landmarks to be united around. This was even more the case since programming that reflected the state's heritage in some sense was especially popular. The Arkansans of the 50s and 60s watched nationally popular programs like Gunsmoke, I Love Lucy, and The Twilight Zone just like everyone else. They especially seemed to enjoy shows like Ozark Jubilee, a variety show featuring the evolving country music genre and depictions of mountain culture, and later rural-themed programming like Hee Haw, Petticoat Junction, and the Beverly Hillbillies. And why not? Those shows were awesome. Radio, meanwhile, had its own unique and very popular shows. The long-running Lum and Abner, a friendly spoof of life in the hills, was set in the fictional town of Pine Ridge, Arkansas, based on the performer's childhood in the real-life town of Waters in Montgomery County, which then changed its name to Pine Ridge to take advantage of the show's popularity. The Delta, meanwhile, could boast of King Biscuit Time, a daily broadcast of blues music on KFFA in Helena that still runs today and is considered a key foundation for the long-term success of that genre, and the inspiration for the King Biscuit Blues Festival that has occurred annually in town since the 80s. One other effect worth mentioning is that it was these radio and television broadcasts which were responsible for elevating the Razorbacks to the pinnacle of sports life in the state. The University of Arkansas had fielded a football team as far back as 1894 and had adopted its famous mascot in 1916, but until World War II, its fan base was mostly limited to the northwestern counties. Over the next 2 decades, though, thanks to the leadership of coaches John Barnhill and Frank Broyles, leading the Razorbacks to multiple conference championships in the Southwest Conference, the move to the SEC wouldn't happen until 1992, and to the successful efforts of boosters to have the games broadcast in Southern and Eastern affiliates, Fayetteville became the undisputed capital of state athletic life in short order. A motorist driving through Malvern in 1960 during a close game between Arkansas and the University of Texas recalled that when he arrived in town, it looked totally deserted, but when the radio announced a Razorbacks win, quote, it just exploded. Like everybody in town yelled at once, and some came running out on the sidewalks, end quote. Which, yeah, still sounds about right. Of course, mass media didn't simply bring different corners of the state together, it also connected Arkansas more thoroughly with the rest of the nation. This could be seen in sports. It was radio in particular that made many residents devoted fans of the St. Louis Cardinals and of other teams in time, and in music. Though King Biscuit and Ozark Jubilee might be wildly popular, so too were the new musical forms of the 50s and 60s, especially rock and roll. Rock music had a particular appeal to youth across America, and the nationally syndicated radio and TV programs had a lot to do with that. But in Arkansas, it also stemmed from the fact that rock was, after all, a mixture of older musical forms with a long history in the state: country, gospel, and blues, among others. Memphis, just across the river, was an acknowledged center of the genre, at least in the pre-Beatles era, and many of the early musicians traveled up and down Highway 67 performing, centering especially on the Newport area. owing to the fact that Jackson County, unlike others, allowed the sale of alcohol. These musicians included not only out-of-staters like Elvis Presley, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Carl Perkins, but also native sons like Sonny Burgess and others who would later migrate back into country music. Harold Jenkins, who wouldn't hit it big until he rebranded himself as Conway Twitty, and most famously of all, Johnny Cash, who, in the opinion of a lot of people, is still the beginning and end of country music as a whole. In these and other ways, Arkansas in the 50s and 60s was clearly not only further modernizing, but also coming to resemble the country at large more and more. The consumption of mass media, the steady urbanization and suburbanization, these were trends that could be seen from California to New York. And to many, this was an unqualified good, leaving behind the primitive past, or what at any rate had the reputation of being the primitive past. But it was not smooth sailing for everyone, not by a long shot. Because the flip side of urban and suburban expansion was a steady downward trend for many rural areas. Although the relative percentage of the population living in the countryside had been declining for several generations now, the general pattern of population growth in the state overall meant that in absolute numbers, rural communities had stayed steady or even slowly increased up through the mid-20th century. Beginning in the 1950s, however, this began to noticeably change. There were many reasons for this. The Great Migration among African Americans was still ongoing, and the expanding transportation network made it easier for people to move off the farm regardless of race. But the real culprit was the mechanization of agriculture. Such equipment as tractors, harvesters, combines, and so on had been around for a while, but there were difficulties in using them for the cotton fields, meaning that crop in particular required a large labor force still. And even into the 60s, the old pattern of dozens of tenants and hired hands heading out into the fields at harvest time to pick the bolls one plant at a time could still be seen throughout the Delta. But as such machines were made more efficient, it became increasingly cost-effective for planters to rely on them rather than on said large labor force. This was only emphasized by the effects of the Great Migration, which convinced many rural employers that tractors and harvesters would be more reliable in the long run anyway. Then too, as artificial fabrics became more available and continued to cut into the demand for cotton, many farmers switched to soybeans, which fetched higher prices and needed fewer laborers to begin with. For planters, smaller farmers, and those they continued to employ, the result of all this was profits that were the same or even higher than what they had been, not to mention a more efficient style of management, the concept of the plantation giving way to that of, well, agribusiness. But for others, it was a much different story. For the first time ever, the lowland counties no longer needed that much human labor, and for many in the lower classes, white and black alike, it was a question of, well, what are we going to do for work now? Some found other jobs or drifted into nearby towns for employment, but it was only a matter of time before the labor markets were saturated there as well. And by the 60s, more and more of them were moving out of the region altogether, headed to nearby larger cities like Little Rock or Memphis, even out of the state itself. Depopulation, in turn, meant that new economic opportunities began drawing up, and for those who remained, the result was, if not outright poverty, a general stagnation and inability to move up in the world. This, of course, is the problem many small towns in Arkansas are faced with even today, and though it can be seen statewide, it was and is especially bad in the Delta, which in only a few decades went from being one of the state's most densely populated and richest regions to being one of its least populated and poorest. The declining fortunes in the Delta, in which so much of Arkansas's African American population was still concentrated, would in time become an aggravating issue in the state's race relations and the civil rights movement in particular. Though the saga of the Little Rock Nine in 1957 was and remains the most vivid episode of that movement connected with this state, that was in no way the end of the story in Arkansas, as the case of the Lost Year demonstrates, even if media attention did later turn to other southern states. There and elsewhere, the emphasis of the movement during the 50s had been on the desegregation of public institutions, including, obviously, the school system. As the 60s began, however, it branched into two new areas. The first was the desegregation of private businesses as well. Earlier in the year 1960, Black college students at various points in the South began holding sit-in strikes at lunch counters, sitting down in the whites-only section and refusing to leave until they were served. This tactic was picked up by a few students from Philander Smith College, who staged such a strike at the Woolworth's lunch counter in downtown Little Rock in March of that year, which resulted in 5 of them being arrested for trespassing. The sit-ins were much slower to bear fruit here than in many southern cities, partly because no violations of federal law by segregationists were involved this time, partly because even the Black middle class and older civil rights leaders were ambivalent about targeting the business community in this way. After a couple years, though, a combination of additional strikes and negotiations between civil rights groups and local businessmen resulted in the lunch counters being desegregated in January 1963, followed by hotels, restaurants, and movie theaters. By year's end, somewhat reassured by the lack of violent confrontation that accompanied these events, the city government had in turn integrated its zoo, arts center, public parks, and golf courses. The second item on the agenda was, not surprisingly, the guarantee of voting rights for African Americans and a general end to political disenfranchisement. In nearby states, such as Mississippi and Alabama, this was the issue that would provoke some of the most infamous violence of the whole period, up to and including the murder of civil rights workers. In Arkansas, though, this sort of thing was generally muted. As we touched on in earlier lectures, measures like the poll tax and the grandfather clause had been heavily watered down in the 40s and early 50s, so that they no longer presented as much of a barrier to blacks voting, and many white elites preferred to manipulate the votes of their black dependents rather than deny them altogether. Already by the early 1960s, about a third of black citizens were registered to vote, well above the level of neighboring states. A third was still not where civil rights leaders wanted it to be, obviously, and in early 1963, one of their organizations, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC for short, sent workers into Arkansas with the goal of launching large-scale voter registration drives. Centered on Pine Bluff especially, and doing most of their work in the Delta, the SNCC activists were periodically the targets of arbitrary arrests, and even a few beatings and threats on their life on occasion, but these were neither extensive nor especially well organized, and by the end of 1964, SNCC and other groups had succeeded in raising the proportion of black voter registration to about half of the state's African American population. As a result, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, eliminating a whole host of racially tinged vote suppression laws nationwide, had a relatively minor effect on Arkansas itself. More and more blacks would cast ballots in the following years, but this was more a continuation of existing trends. None of this meant that the controversy over civil rights had been resolved by the mid-1960s, because it certainly had not. As time went on, portions of the movement would radicalize and start demanding more economic equality, even becoming more antagonistic towards whites as a whole, especially in the so-called Black Power phrase, which would alienate many of its original supporters. But that was still a bit in the future. More important just now was that while integration was occurring on multiple fronts, it was still stalled out in most of the public schools. Not just in Little Rock, but in most communities with a high black population, desegregation had ended on paper, but only on paper, with no more than 1 to 2% of black students being admitted to white schools. In the capital, there would be no repeats of the mob action that had made the Little Rock Nine famous, but neither was opposition to integration going away. For one thing, the publication of proposals for a mass consolidation of white and black schools drew the anger of pretty much all parties who did not want to see their own community schools closed down, regardless of how they felt about the issue. And for another, it was just at this time that the civil rights movement began to radicalize, undercutting much of the previous support for it among the white community. So the two sides were at a deadlock into the late 1960s, and much the same was true in other cities. With a few notable exceptions, especially a clash between police and protesters in the Crittenden County town of Earl in September 1970, arguably the last race riot in the state, there was no widespread violence. Instead, most began looking for ways to sidestep integration altogether. When the federal court system issued more orders for a speedier process of desegregation from 1968 on, whites in biracial districts, taking a page from the events of the lost year, began pulling them out altogether in large numbers. Those who had the means to began enrolling their children in private schools, others simply relocated. If they lived in the downtown neighborhoods of Little Rock, for example, they moved out to the mostly white suburbs. By the early 1970s, schools throughout the state had officially integrated. Threatened with the withdrawal of federal funds if they didn't, they ultimately had no choice in the matter. But the civil rights leaders, it was not a very satisfactory form of integration. Black students could now attend formerly all-white public schools, but in many cases, they were now the only ones attending. Desegregation and other aspects of the civil rights movement would have long echoes extending over the next several decades. But we're not ready to talk about that just yet. Instead, it's time we wrap this up by looking at the effect all these trends had on political life in the state through the end of the 1960s. Throughout most of this period, the man at the very top of the state government apparatus continued to be the same one, Orville E. Faubus. His unprecedented 6 consecutive terms as governor were only partly the result of his appeal to segregationists, for it has to be remembered that while some in that crowd were motivated by racial prejudice, for others it was at least partly resentment towards what they saw as the heavy-handed tactics of the federal government. To them, Faubus was bravely standing up for the rights of their state. Plus, his opposition to integration was matched by a continuing interest in reforms in such fields as education, infrastructure building, and care for the disabled. Reforms we looked at last time, and which were very real and beneficial in their effects. During the mid-1960s, moreover, he would gain fame in a different way by vocally supporting efforts to block the Corps of Engineers' planned construction of a dam on the Buffalo River to provide hydroelectric power. Though Faubus had supported such projects in the past, he also, as an Ozarks native, had an appreciation for the natural beauty of the region and evidently came to feel that by damming the river and submerging the breathtaking canyons it had carved out, the state would lose more than it would gain. His December 1965 letter to the Corps announcing his opposition to the project may not have been single-handedly responsible for turning the tide. The National Park Service had already come out against it as well. But it was immediately after this event that the Corps pulled the plug on the project, leading directly to the Buffalo being designated as America's first national river in 1972. Like I said, if you take out the whole segregation issue, Faubus probably comes off with a pretty decent reputation. And even where race relations were concerned, he was seen by many in the state as something of a moderate. Even during and after the showdown with the Little Rock Nine, he maintained contacts with local civil rights leaders, continued to appoint blacks to government jobs, and by the mid 60s, as the growing number of black voters became evident, began reaching out to the African American community to gain their support, with some success. All this helps explain Faubus's long hold on power. But nothing lasts forever, of course. Most blacks, and many moderate whites, were still antagonistic towards him over the events in Little Rock, and there was growing evidence of political and financial corruption surrounding the governor. Cases of associates of his abusing their offices, and of Faubus himself approving business deals in return for personal kickbacks. As the 1966 gubernatorial elections approached, he still had enough support in the state that he stood a reasonable chance of being reelected once again, but decided to leave under his own power and announced he would not run again. After 12 years in charge, longer than any Arkansas governor before or since, he left office in early 1967, and though he would make a few comeback attempts in later years, his era was, for all intents and purposes, at an end. Faubus's departure was significant not just in itself, though, but also because of who would succeed him. Ever since Reconstruction ended, the majority of white Arkansans had been loyal to the Democratic Party. This was occasionally challenged by some third-party reform movements, but rarely did they consider going over to the Republicans. Until the 1966 election, that is, when quite a few of them did, resulting in the election of Winthrop Rockefeller, Arkansas's first Republican governor in 92 years. Exactly how this turnover came about, why it was not quite as out of the blue as I just made it sound, and what it meant for the state's future are all things that will wait until next time.